You Ethicuties and the 40% of you who have not yet subscribed to the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you are all about fixing your workplaces to make our world better, we got a treat for you today. Hot topics in ethics and compliance in HR. Two of our all-time favorites. You got Ethicsverse royalty here. You got Karen and you got Matt. So let's give them a nice round of applause, a nice welcome. And I'm going to run through some quick announcements here. Here's our link tree. So if you have not followed us on YouTube, I encourage you to do that. Follow us on LinkedIn as well. There's great content put out there every single day, I think. Should be. If it's not, let me know. And we are going to be giving away 5 books again today. So, of course, this is the book we're featuring, but you can pick any book from the Ethical Library. There are dozens and dozens of books, and those are all there for you to pick. So be active in the chat, share your concerns, share your tactics and techniques to increase your odds of winning. We did a demo recently, or we had a sales conversation with someone recently, and they didn't know what Ethico was. They just had heard about the Ethicsverse, and they didn't know what we do. So we have an ethics and compliance software platform that helps you to crowdsource more risk intelligence, to manage your work in a more efficient way, to analyze and direct your efforts toward the things that are necessary, that are the biggest fires, while at the same time creating, demonstrable effectiveness in your program. That's what we aim to do. So if you're ever interested in that and seeing what we're all about, please go ahead and check us out. We're giving away a year free still. People seem to love that. It helps to really de-risk. So here are some great podcasts that I talk about every week. And I also want to get to this survey. So for those of you who participated in the survey, mwah, love you. Thank you so much. We are hungry for feedback. We want this to be a valuable resource for the ethics and compliance and human resource community. We want this to be a place where we can get together every single week. And, we want this time to be valuable for you. So any feedback you can give us, good, bad, or ugly, please click this survey and fill it out. It should take you about 3 or 4 minutes. All right. We got the one and only Matt Kelly, coolest guy in compliance. Love your spacesuit, Matt. And we got me. Hello. And we got the one and only Karen Moore. Karen, love your spacesuit as well. That's a nice outfit you got going there. How are we doing today, guys?
We are doing well, Nick. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. As always, we got an awful lot to cover this quarter. Our quarterly update on what's compliance news is, and I got a long list that we can go through.
All right. Well, let's dive in. We got a lot of fun topics, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Sure. So for everybody who is just joining us for the first time, we hold these sessions about once a quarter or so, looking over recent compliance events and news to try and derive what the good lessons are for the rest of the corporate ethics and compliance community. I typically go through what I think some of these big issues are, and then I ask Karen Moore and Nick for their color commentary and analysis about all of this. But first, I wanted to say, for anybody who's listening, if you have ideas of big stuff that you have seen in the headlines recently that you would like us to try to take a crack at, please do. You can pop that into the attendee chat. Just let us know what big issues you think are on your mind. And the more newsy, the better. We are not afraid to try and give some live commentary. But other than that, here are some of my big ideas that we're hoping to get at in the next hour. First, I flagged some trends in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the enforcement thereof, where we are seeing some very interesting cases with some pretty egregious misconduct, and yet the Justice Department does not seem to be assigning compliance monitors, like we always used to think that was standard practice. Not happening. I wanted to talk a bit about artificial intelligence and the threat of AI washing, where you are disclosing to investors that your approach to AI is awesome and great and risk-free, and that turns out not to be true. And then suddenly the SEC is pursuing an enforcement action against you. We have seen that already start to happen, and just some thoughts about how you would get ahead of that. I wanted to talk a bit about the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the banking regulator. I don't know if anybody saw, but just yesterday, they published the results of an internal investigation, which was not at all nice reading, that they, for many years now, have had a terrible corporate culture, and some thoughts about what the challenges are to enforcing a good culture, whistleblower programs, which apparently the hotline at the FDIC was not trusted. Why not? How can you make sure that you do have trusted people trusting in the internal system? And even some crazy oddball things, that NBA player who got called out for betting on his own performance and data analytics to figure out his misconduct. We got a lot that we want to get on here. But certainly if you, the listener, do have any other questions you want to us to either explore, or you have comments on what we're saying, the more feedback we get, the better. So by all means. I'm going to start by just recapping this FCPA trend I've seen. And then Karen, I'd love to get your analysis on this, and Nick as well. But over the last 6 months, we've seen, I think, at least 4 or 5 significant FCPA enforcement actions from the Justice Department and the SEC, where this was all misconduct that was somehow like deeply flawed as they were trying to engage with the Justice Department. Like there wasn't the voluntary self-disclosure you're supposed to do. There was not the cooperation, at least at the start, that the Justice Department says it wants. And they had long said voluntary self-disclosure, full cooperation, all the remediation, you do that and you'll avoid a compliance monitor. These companies didn't do that. They still avoided a compliance monitor. Instead, they have enhanced compliance reporting. And that's the thing. So, Karen, I guess my first question is, what do you think of all this, or what are we supposed to make of all this? And, we can explore what, if you're doing enhanced reporting, what is that? And what does that mean for a compliance officer who has to do it? But just at the high level, what do you think about what has been going on with these FCPA enforcement issues lately?
Yeah, your guess is as good as mine, Matt, because if you're going to establish criteria for imposing a monitor, as the Monaco memo in 2022 did pretty clearly, or even kind of raise the monitor flag the way Brian Benchkowski did in 2018, you've got to make use of the tool, or you've got to start doing the analysis in a way that is consistent and transparent. So I'm not, offering an opinion that a monitor is a good thing to impose or it's the right thing to impose, so much as I'm thinking that if it's in the toolkit and you don't provide some sort of consistency in its use, or to take a look at some of these recent FCPA cases and say, there's all this egregious activity, or you're not meeting some of the prongs under voluntary self-disclosure for more favorable treatment, then if you're not imposing a monitor, what are you substituting it with? And this kind of enhanced disclosures and things is a substitute, but we haven't, I don't think, heard word one about that as a substitute for monitor as a policy decision. So I went back to take a look at how often have monitors been imposed, and I may have it wrong, but I think we're like in a dozen kind of cases since 2018. So it has not been a very widely used tool.
Oh, you're saying monitors have not been a widely used tool?
No.
Interesting. So maybe it's that. I mean, I didn't know that. I thought it was a lot more pervasive than what you just said.
I guess my question here is, so I have heard from compliance officers who shall remain nameless, but they were at large companies that got monitors. And basically, more than one of them said, well, what's going on? We were better at this. We voluntarily self-disclosed. We did cooperate. We got a monitor because, in my opinion, they deserved it because their abuses were extensive. But, they're trying to figure out what is this new standard for when you would or wouldn't get a monitor. And you're right, Karen, that there hasn't been any official policy announcement that they're changing things. I do see that clearly the Justice Department wants to have a cooperative sort of a posture with companies, that if you work with them, they will try to give you a reasonably favorable settlement. But it seems to me that with the half dozen or so cases we've seen since late last fall, that there haven't been any monitors, and yet their attempt to fulfill the 3 prongs of that program of voluntary disclosure and cooperation, like they're missing some of the prongs. But instead now we have this enhanced compliance reporting obligation. So I'm also still confused about what would that mean for a compliance officer then? Because I guess maybe you're reporting directly to the Justice Department more often, quarterly. That seems to be some of the terms in some of these agreements, or even potentially monthly, which I've also heard that in reality they're meeting with the fraud section once a month just to see what's going on. But what would a compliance officer need to have to be able to succeed in that sort of position? Karen, what do you think first? Or Nick, what do you think first?
No, that's fine. I think they're kind of signaling this cooperation thing. I mean, ostensibly the bar for a monitor is higher than we thought it was, or at least was in the past, right? So you would think with these egregious acts, this would be the exact thing that would require one. And Karen said, the folks who get a CIA require IROs. Why no compliance monitors for egregious actions? So that's a great question. And I'd love for you to weigh in, Matt, on if there were any hints, as Terry asked, like, are there any hints in those decisions on why they've made this move? It sounds like there might not be. But to your question of like, what does a compliance officer need? I was talking to Andrew McBride recently, and he seems like, this is the Albemarle guy. It seems like his engagement with the DOJ was like the antithesis of what everybody fears. It seemed like it was very cooperative and it was almost collaborative. And perhaps, that experience was one that they're trying to emulate and replicate. And if, by removing this sort of third-party monitor and just dealing, directly, it's going to require a different level of collaboration, and it might unlock some of the value that you just kind of alluded to in that anecdote, where some folks are like, we were doing this better on our own before. You know what I'm saying? So in the context of all of that, I would say that what a compliance officer needs is not a desire to like appease some regulatory body or some third party, but rather a desire to appease themselves and appease their own common sense to drive an effective program forward. And I think if you can focus on that allows for a lot more confidence in those conversations and a lot more natural, or like naturally less defensiveness. And if we're solving for the context of our business, the things we know, the things that we do better, I think it can allow for a lot more remediation, a lot more quickly than somebody kind of coming in and being, kind of that third wheel.
Well, Karen, give me your response to that, because first, I do think, Nick, you bring up a good point that I think, ideally the Justice Department would like to have that cooperative relationship, just like what Andrew McBride apparently was describing. But I also think we have to remember, at the end of these 3-year settlement agreements, where you have been making these enhanced compliance reporting meetings for, usually you have to come up with one progress report per year and quarterly meetings along the way to talk about what'll be in the progress report or whatnot. But at the end of it, you're still, the CCO, you have to certify the effectiveness of the compliance program. So your name is still on a dotted line somewhere. But Karen, what do you think about, how what would you need to have to be able to succeed under that kind of position if you're a CCO?
Yeah, so much of it is situation dependent. So I don't want to come down too hard on one side or the other, but one of the, I think bywords of the fraud section, at least in the last 5 years or so, has been this collaborative relationship. If you voluntarily self-disclose, we've got all sorts of time for you in terms of discussing what you've been doing since the misconduct, giving you all sorts of credit. So there's already this intention to have a spirit of collaboration, cooperation, working together to a common end, which is to fix the problems that gave rise to the misconduct to begin with. So, in that regard, kudos to the fraud section. I don't know that replacing that ongoing collaborative relationship for a independent or quasi-independent monitor is always necessarily the right approach, though, because the monitor, first of all, has extensive experience in compliance programs, which parts of the DOJ may have, parts of the DOJ may not have. So what you go in for your monthly or quarterly discussion directly with the DOJ without a kind of interceding experienced monitor, and then what does the DOJ give back to you? Like, oh, well, we don't think that's sufficient policy development. We don't think that your training platform is, on what basis are they providing that kind of guidance? And the benefit a good monitor, and I had a great experience with a monitor, just, to disclose that, not on a DOJ matter, but on a Department of the Navy matter. If there's a collaboration between the chief compliance officer and the monitor is also there to say, this is a good policy development, this is a good training platform. So I don't know, that the monitor can be beneficial to both sides of the equation. Not saying that you shouldn't have a good relationship with the DOJ or hope to expand upon that, but I'm kind of more leery of what these progress reports and certifications are going to create than I am maybe about having a monitor who's professionally providing in lieu of those.
It's interesting that I think we should all remember, number one, most of us are never going to get to see what these progress reports look like. They don't become public. Number two, as much as I sometimes wonder about the CCO certifications, nobody has actually signed any of them yet, because you sign them at the end of your 3-year term, and they've only been around for, I think, 2.5 years. I believe the very first CCOs to actually sign one and be done with it, that won't happen until the end of this year or early 2025. So sometimes I wonder if we're making a mountain out of a molehill, but I still come back to thinking through that, does this relationship help a compliance officer? Because you'll have a better time working with the rest of your enterprise to say, these reforms are important that we get them done. I'm working with the DOJ and I'm going to, meet with them again at the end of the quarter. If we don't do this, that's going to look bad. So you, in the first line of defense, you're going to have to work with me on this. Does it strengthen their position in some way? Especially if you're already under a deferred prosecution agreement, like the CEO is going to pay attention to that and elevate the importance of your role, I think. But I'm not entirely sure how this will all work out in practice.
I think it can elevate the role. It just depends on how we take advantage of that opportunity. I mean, this is a massive opportunity for what you're talking about internally. And I think it's also a massive opportunity externally, like getting the DOJ or some third party, some, oversight body comfortable. It's not just an objective activity. There's also a lot of subjectivity in that. And I think the more interaction, the more access, the more sort of conversation you have with those folks, they get a better view and a better picture of like, okay, well, who's riding this horse? Like, who has the reins of this thing? Is this somebody who's competent, who's authentically trying to fix these problems and is aligned with us? Or is this somebody who's cagey and is kind of an empty suit and is really just trying to check boxes and get me out of their hair? I think those two different sort of assessments or those two different conclusions lead on totally different paths throughout it. And then from the internal perspective, to your point, if you have this endorsement and you're walking around with the DOJ badge, effectively in the organization, that's another massive opportunity for more interaction, more access throughout the organization to show your common sense, the fact that we're all wearing the same jersey, getting these people to participate in this, risk management apparatus that we're at the head of in some degrees. This is a lot of opportunity for us. And I think the unknown usually gives us kind of a little bit of anxiety. But I think if we can sort through the fog of that unknown, there's a lot of like pearls of opportunity for us to elevate and magnify the impact.
Karen, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there are arguments on both sides, to be honest. That having a monitor means you've got somebody to, intercede and maybe provide a voice of experience that is going to be heard more strongly by the DOJ than coming from an interested party like the chief compliance officer. On the other side, you've got a monitor. It's hugely expensive. It's very intrusive. It's demoralizing to the organization. Can you substitute out a lot of that expertise either by putting a new SECO in place or making sure the SECO's got external advisors that are really going to help them, but who are, acting only in their own interests. So, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I just would say more, hey, DOJ, just be a little more clear on what you're doing here and why and when.
Take it easy now. Take it easy. You want clarity from these guys? Just kidding. Alexandra had a good question. I wonder whether the company would be able to reflect on its own gaps without the external assessments by the monitor, and how much can the DOJ deep dive into the developments through self-reporting? It's kind of what you were talking about.
It's, that's a good question. And my very first thought reading it would be, well, how strong is the internal audit team at this company, assuming you even have one? That the compliance monitor, or, occasionally I've seen it at the SEC, they describe them as compliance consultants. If you have a civil settlement with the SEC, but really that's a monitor. like they're paid to come in and do very objective external assessments, which are not necessarily a fun time and fun reading, but they can be worthwhile. Do you have some other avenue to get that same frank assessment if you're only doing it yourself, because there is no monitor? Your internal audit team might be able to do it. Your internal audit team might not. You might not have one at all. So I do wonder if what's missing, or how do you fill in that gap, so to speak, if you don't have the monitor there to be able to give you that frank analysis, which might not be a fun time, but it's still worth listening to it.
Well, you can still hire the exact same person that would be your monitor, and you can hire them directly so that they're not reporting directly to the DOJ, which has its pluses and minuses, and you still have the advantage of all that expertise.
That is true.
Or, get somebody to conduct an assessment and gap analysis of your program.
All right. So issue 2 for our hour, I wanted to talk a bit about the news this week from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. If listeners have not yet seen this, go open the front page of the Wall Street Journal or pretty much any business news outlet, and you'll see really terrible stuff from the FDIC. So they're the regulator for banks, making sure that the banks are financially solvent. And they do a lot of field work with local banks. And if the bank is insolvent, they swoop in on a Friday, they repackage it, they merge it with a healthier bank by Monday. But they had been accused of having a terrible corporate culture, rife with sexual harassment, rife with office bullying, rife with whistleblower retaliation. The employees did not trust the whistleblower system. There was a long pattern going back to nearly 20 years of, if somebody did complain about a supervisor, that supervisor may have been rotated to a different FDIC field office or promoted, so they were no longer dealing with their subordinate. Lots of talk about booze-filled parties at the FDIC training headquarters because they bought their own hotel right next to the FDIC headquarters in Washington. Total mess. So that news broke last fall. FDIC commissioned an external investigation, and that report was released yesterday or Tuesday by a large law firm, 235 pages long. If you happen to have a good spare 6 hours or so and you want to read it, it's really rife with a lot of interesting nuggets about an effective corporate culture, or the lack thereof, at the FDIC. I wanted to actually, Nick, I'll pose this first question to you, because a lot of this is about leadership and corporate culture, and I know that's your jam. So they did fault the longtime senior executive there, Martin Grunberg, who is these days the FDIC chairman, but he's been in one of the top dogs there in one form or another for nearly 20 years. But really, they said that the leader there was basically not approachable, very gruff. He kindly disputed that. But, I'm still stuck on how they said they wanted a good, strong, effective ethical culture, and yet they couldn't enforce that at their local offices throughout the United States. And what is so challenging about trying to impose your corporate culture across a big, sprawling organization? And what should the leader be doing? Whether Mr. Grunenberg did or didn't do that, it's kind of beside our conversation right now. But how on earth how is this so hard? What do you think, Nick?
So I think like a good culture is like a song, and it might start with one person, but like in a large organization, if there's just one person singing that, or a large decentralized sprawling organization, if there's one person singing it, well, not everyone's going to hear that song, right? So like for your culture to be real and authentic, everybody has to be kind of humming that song. Everybody has to kind of know that song. And it sounds like this guy at the top, this gruff guy, doesn't sound like he's that good of a singer. You know what I'm saying? Like you have to make that if you go into a store or you go into a restaurant, they're so intentional about every aspect of that whole experience. They're intentional about the plates they use, and they're intentional about the playlist that they use. Like if we as leaders don't have intentionality about the playlist we want to play in our restaurant, whether that's our whole company or our team or whatever project team we're working on, then it's going to be silence and everyone's going to be kind of singing their own song. It's on us as leaders to try to affect that tune that's in people's mind. And look, in a decentralized thing, I think it's a good analogy because, if we're all in one room, it's a lot easier for my voice to like propel and hit everybody's ear. If we're all in different places, I have to figure out a way to get that into your ears, right? So how is that going to happen? It can either be by making sure that your local leaders are all singing that same song and we're constantly, practicing together, or something. But like, it is effectable, but as it gets wider, it gets harder. There's more coordination. There's more prints of the song sheet, and there's more people in that chorus you have to make sure are in tune. So I can keep going with the song thing if you want, or I can pivot to a restaurant. I'm just kidding.
No, I think the song analogy is great because that's where I think a lot of leaders get stuck, is that they know what they want the song to be. They can sing it in the corporate offices, but when you had said, you have to make sure the local leaders are also singing the same tune, and how difficult that is. And I don't mean to say like, how hard can that be? I know it can be extremely difficult. And I'm marveling at how difficult and persistent a challenge this is for leaders to get that second level to keep singing the same chorus.
Have you ever seen Whiplash? Anybody, you guys seen that movie Whiplash?
I know of it. I have not seen it.
Okay, so it's this movie. This kid is at this jazz college, and he's trying to get onto this jazz band. And the guy from the farmers commercials, We Are Farmers, that guy. He's like the main guy. He's the antagonist in it. And this guy is so psychotic about how his song that he's composed is playing. It's like, he's like a lunatic about it. And I'm not saying that we have to be to this guy's, I wish I remembered his name, J.K. something? J.K. Simmons. Yeah. Like, we don't have to be that psycho, but like, there was a commitment that he exuded about, like, we have to get this song right. And if that's not a main priority for a leader to get whatever the song is right, then it's just going to kind of get sloppy and it's going to be sort of all over the place. It has to be a top priority,
Karen, what do you think about all of this leadership and culture challenges and just how flummoxing it is, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I mean, they're pervasive. First, I'm just going to say, if you want to go ahead and take a look at that report, by all means do so. But Matt Kelly has already provided us with some great commentary, and just encouraging you to take the shortcut that I did and read his comments on radical compliance. So Matt, thank you for doing all that legwork for us yesterday, taking a look through such a long report. Look, all organizations have this problem, but any organization that's highly decentralized has particular challenges. And one of the biggest challenges you have when you've got such a decentralized program is that risk of microcultures happening. So people may want to be singing the same tune, but singing it in a different key, or sometimes people want to change the tune altogether despite what they're hearing from the top. And the further removed you are from that centralized song making, the more opportunity you have as a leader to kind of stray off path, whether intentionally or not. But I've seen people be the victims of microcultures and feel that they don't have a voice outside of that. They are held hostage to, almost like a Stockholm syndrome, to this small part of the organization that may be led by a toxic or simply a poor leader, and feel that they don't have an out, despite published helplines, despite messages that they're getting from the center. If the people at the center responsible for creating that culture and fostering that culture are not visible throughout the organization, then that leads to kind of a lack of confidence that anything is going to happen. So, we get back to some of the old points about prove that something's going to happen. If somebody speaks up, that they're protected, prove that there's an outcome, prove that there's action that's being taken, prove that kind of levelism occurs, that it doesn't matter if it's a leader in a really productive and important part of the organization. If they don't get it, they're out of there. So you really have to show even more that you mean what you say when you've got a decentralized organization. And then right. I will also say, and it can be a topic for a whole other conversation, I'm not a really big fan of ethics ambassadors, but in these kinds of decentralized organizations, you need people locally who feel empowered on behalf of that smaller group to have some sort of a voice centrally or some sort of obligation centrally. And so decentralized, maybe that kind of ethics ambassador system becomes a lot more effective, or at least a lot more important.
It's interesting that you talk about the ambassadors there and how important they are for that structure, because the thing that jumped out to me first in the post I wrote yesterday about this was, if you look at the FDIC's structure, so yes, highly decentralized, but also in the personnel, and this matters, is that you are a trainee for 4 or 5 years as a junior inspector and commissioner. And then you get basically promoted. My understanding of it is it's kind of equivalent to getting tenure at an education institution. You become a commissioned examiner for the FDIC. And these commissioned examiners had enormous career power over their subordinates. And they're operating in dozens of field offices throughout the United States. And they're operating in very close quarters a lot. You're on the road or you're spending the whole weekend together. And as soon as you think of it that way, you're like, yikes, our culture risk, our risks of harassment, humans are humans and they can make poor decisions. That risk, just from the structure, is sky high. So we often talk about assessing the culture risk. I think it's important just to look at the overall structure, because then you can understand how many song leaders do we actually need, which is just another way of saying ambassadors. Like, that seems like that should be a really high priority for a group like that. And I was struck by just how much the structure and the mission of the FDIC would give rise to the potential for misconduct unless you were on that like a ton of bricks, and they weren't. But the other thing that I wanted to get at with the FDIC, and this is the last point for this issue here, but I was also struck that the employees didn't trust the hotline system, that identities would become known, identities would be leaked, they would suffer retaliation. And I'm stuck on this because this is 2024. We have been talking about good anonymous reporting and good protection protocols for 15 years, and we still don't have it. So I didn't know that we'd need to go through like the nuts and bolts of, is it really that hard to keep whistleblower systems effective? But I mean, Nick, I'll ask you first and then Karen, like, how is it that we are still stuck on this? We can't get the block and tackle done.
Man, I'm famously naive. I've just been so naive at how some of these large, big, established organizations, like just how messy it is behind the scenes. In many cases, there's smaller organizations, 1,000, 5,000 people that have compliance programs and controls and just like a drive for impact that's orders of magnitude beyond what you see at some of these larger, more well-established organizations, where you think what we're talking about right here, for example, would be like kind of table stakes. So it's a little bit baffling, but I think it always kind of comes down to like what's important to the person at the helm, what's important to the person, over that particular program. And are we communicating appropriately, right? Like that fear of retaliation is got to be based in some kind of actual experience, right? This belief that the anonymity protections don't work is based on some violation of that. So, if that's going on, you have to hit that head on. You have to full court press on that sentiment, because that sentiment is going to grow. And before you know it, you're going to be in such a deep pit, it's going to be hard to dig out of. It's baffling to me, but there's so many voicemail box still out there. I mean, it's wild. Large companies that are still using a voicemail box, and that, they think, oh, well, we don't have any issues, So it can just be a blind spot. It can be kind of a half-assed attempt to solve a problem. Or it's just, straight, negligence. I mean, I feel like it's got to be one of those three.
So, Karen, what do you recommend or think about when we're talking just about, basic, how do you run a whistleblower system to keep these reporter identities anonymous? And how is this leaking out? How should people be thinking about that? And then some other people want more color later on after that. What are your concerns about ambassador programs, since you mentioned that you're not always a fan of them? Some people are wondering if you could expound on that. But before you get to that, what do you think about these whistleblower complaint breakdowns?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think you need to look at the semantics and stop calling them whistleblower lines and calling people whistleblowers, because that just carries so much baggage with it. And you want people to feel like they can speak up, whether anonymously or not, just sometimes when they're not sure about something and they want guidance, and then to raise a concern clearly. I mean, even speaking up anonymously, that is a brave, difficult act for an employee. You're betraying your immediate collective. And so if you do have this microculture, now you're really putting your head above the parapet, waiting to be shot down. So that, there's the betrayal, there's it's not my job, it's all the reasons that people don't report. I don't want to get somebody in trouble. So it's not just betraying the collective. It may also be, getting John, the single dad who's struggling to make ends meet, fired because he did something stupid. It may be, that you fear retaliation. And so is the number one. So I'm a big fan of culture and integrity surveys when they're done right. I think they give you really great data that will give you some insights as to why people may not be using these reporting lines. And then the whole anonymity thing, I think, FDIC aside, because we're still in a kind of wild west when it comes to privacy laws here, but I've worked in international organizations, managing the privacy implications of anonymous reporting. I'm going to also probably engender a whole bunch of questions there, but I'm not a big fan of anonymous reporting, and we have to do it sometimes because the regulators say we have to do it, and sometimes because it's better to get something anonymously than not at all. But to me, where people are not reporting because they don't have confidence in being able to do it anonymously, you raise the whole series of questions about why are they concerned about putting their name against it. Having said that, if you have anonymous reporting, you have got to secure that anonymous reporting. There cannot be access to and eyes on that reporter unless that is, kind of compromised by other legal requirements. But, ensuring that anonymity, respecting the reporter, really giving them confidence that what they are saying is going to be followed up, and establishing a reporting line, which does not work with voicemail. I second Nick's, concern there, that there is an ability to interact on an anonymous level with the reporter. I mean, that's really critical, even if it's just a PIN number and all of that back and forth.
I mean, and there's also value in having a third party whose reputation hinges on their ability to provide that protection. That's an added control to it. So I don't know how that anonymous violation would have happened if there was a third party involved, right? That's just such a natural control, we do so much to make sure that never would happen. We do so much to make sure that somebody who's calling in or interacting, they know that they're protected. So it just kind of makes me, I haven't seen the report, but were they using a third party at all?
I was going to say, I don't know, because that is subject for a future post I'm going to tackle there, specifically about their hotline breakdowns. But I can remember, for example, how this can happen. Sometime more than a few years ago now, late 2010s, the Government Accountability Office published a fascinating report. They had audited the hotlines at the Pentagon and the Defense Department. Now, the Defense Department is so huge that they have 11 or 12 different hotline reporting programs. But what might happen is that you would call the wrong one. You are an Air Force person and you call the Army's hotline. They'll take their information and report, and then they'll just email all of that to the Air Force person. But now suddenly, I didn't call the Air Force maybe I didn't call them for a reason. Maybe I did want to go to the Army deliberately, even though I'm in the Air Force. But it was that sort of basic protocols about how you actually handle a whistleblower's identity, that it was sloppy because it was a big organization, and now suddenly the name is out. And that would then trickle back down. And I'm not surprised that the Defense Department had a lot of cynical attitudes. And I do wonder if that's going to surface in this FDIC examination as well.
Well, and also, by the way, if you're doing harassment and sexual harassment allegations, it's really hard to remain anonymous. It's really hard to investigate if somebody's going to be anonymous. So, it's one thing to make an anonymous call that says, I saw Harry handing a big, suitcase full of cash to the Minister of Finance. But to say, hey, look, I was sexually harassed, or I viewed sexual harassment in the organization, it's really hard to pursue that without actually being able to talk to the person. Plus, by the way, when there's anonymous reporting, then there's a lot of guesswork on the part of people. It's like, oh, it's an anonymous report. We don't know. We're not going to try and know. And then everyone's like, ooh, I wonder if it was Sally. I want, so there's the pros and cons there too. Let me give my, if we're done with this part.
Yes.
Because I know people are really big fans of ambassador programs, and I don't want to say I'm not a fan of them. I think they're really hard to do well, and I've very rarely seen them do well. So often, very well-meaning ambassador programs are, I'm going to find all sorts of people, I'm going to get them to take on an ethics role and obligation, but it's on top of a huge job that they already have. And it's asking them maybe to do things that they're either not comfortable doing or not equipped to do, or it's asking them to do some really pro forma things like hang up some posters and do a thing or two. So I've seen it kind of all over the place. The only times I see it done well, and I think it's really hard, it's a big burden on an organization, are first of all, when it's part of the job description. So the person is being measured on their performance and rewarded for their performance. And adjacent to that, we're taking on that role is seen as a really good development step. It's something that is going to enhance your ability to advance in the organization. So I think those two things. And then the third, which is tough because it's expensive, is those people have got to be properly trained and equipped. What's expected of them and what can you give them that will allow them to succeed in the role of ethics ambassador. So I should qualify by saying not that I'm not a fan of them, I'm just not a fan of them being done kind of with good intentions, but half-heartedly and where they, they end up petering out.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is there's so many, like everyone does it so much different, in so many different ways. The load of work on these people is very different. Sometimes it's acknowledged by the organization as something valuable. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's part of a bonus. Sometimes it's not. All those things are these like layered confluence of incentives that can create a lot of headwinds for it, to your point, for it to get done, right being in the context of whatever the scope is, Yeah,
and it can be a great thing, especially when you've got a global organization, because you literally have somebody speaking the same language of the people that they're working with, and that can be a huge impediment for more centralized office. So I'll backpedal a little bit. I'm not a fan of the programs. I just think that people underestimate how to do them well.
All right. So issue 3 for our hour, I wanted to talk a bit about how companies are talking about how they use artificial intelligence, because the Securities and Exchange Commission now has been amping up its attention to AI washing, which is a terrible shorthand name. But the idea that you are disclosing in your 10K or 10Q or other documents, and that I think is an important point, that your company is doing very good with AI. We are paying close attention to all of its risks, and we are managing it quite well. And then it turns out subsequently you have a failure, and now the SEC might swoop in and say you misled investors on that. And for anybody who's listening says, well, we're not publicly traded, I don't have to worry about the SEC, I'm going to take the next 10 minutes off. No, do not, because this also is very similar to what the Federal Trade Commission has been enforcing for years around data privacy, where you tell customers and consumers, we have great data privacy practices, and then you suffer a breach, and the Federal Trade Commission will say, well, you misled consumers, so here is your consent decree and your fine. And I do think that this talk of AI washing is very similar to this risks around what you say about privacy or what you've said about cybersecurity. And the SEC and the Federal Trade Commission and possibly other regulators, they have all taken enforcement actions already for making misleading statements. And I'm not so worried as much about there are senior level people who are deliberately plotting to lie to investors that their AI usage is a mess and we're just going to fib about that. I don't think that's happening. Right. I'm more concerned that the senior level people actually do believe that our values statement, our AI ethical principles that we posted on the website last month, we're behaving and we're hitting all those targets. And 9 levels down the organization, your developers are actually saying, well, that's all baloney and nobody's listening to us as we say we're nowhere near this. That is exactly what the SEC had used to file a lawsuit against SolarWinds last year for improper disclosure of its cybersecurity risks. They were saying everything was great. Internally, their lower minions were saying that's not great at all. Senior people don't know what's going on. So it wasn't disclosing your risks outward to investors. It was, are you capturing everything being disclosed up within your organization? And I don't know that we are. And that's really what the question I wanted to pose to you and Karen and Nick is, what are these challenges here about getting people to report up what the risks actually are of a new tech or your data practices or whatever, and how to make sure that you're hearing all of that so you don't say something incorrect at the senior level. Like, how much should we be worried about this? Karen, what do you think first?
Well, first of all, there's the truth in marketing. So it doesn't matter who you are as an organization, public, private, big, small. You can't say that you're doing something that you're not doing. It's just a lie to consumers. So all sorts of black marks for that. Here I would say that from a compliance perspective, if you do not have marketing and AI and privacy and cyber on your radar, you're missing some big pictures on the one hand. On the other hand, how big is your department, and how much expertise do you have, and how many resources do you have, and how much of a voice you have? And this is the constant issue that I see, that compliance officers, even well-resourced ones, tend to have pretty tight teams. They tend to have specific expertise, and there are only so many seats you can put your behind in. But things like marketing, things like proxy statements, kind of these big statements that you're making, you need eyes on them. In the AI context, one of the challenges that I find is the same as the data privacy challenge, which is trying to actually catalog where and how in the organization AI is being used, and what level of scrutiny or control should be placed on that, and how much does everyone need to know. So just getting a handle on that. Now, should that be the compliance team, or should that be another team? I think data governance generally is something that is still under-resourced in a lot of organizations, but somebody's got to have an eye on that big picture and have some sort of level of understanding and control. So that's where I'm starting. I'm starting with there. I will just add, it just seemed really weird to me in these two instances. These were investment advisors touting their use of AI to make investment choices for their clients. It feels like to me, if I'm paying you as an investment advisor, you should be able to do this out of your brains. I wouldn't be gloating about the fact that I'm using AI, because I can use AI. I can plug in some stuff and make investment decisions. But that I'm sure it was more sophisticated.
It's funny, the two AI washing enforcement actions we've seen from the SEC so far are sort of imperfect vehicles for my point here, because most of us are not employed at investment advisory firms that are trying to solicit customers by wooing them with their AI statements. But the SEC enforcement people have also said publicly traded operating companies, like most of us on this webinar, you too need to make sure that if you're saying something about how you're governing AI, you're actually saying something that's accurate. But Nick, what do you think about this? And this really, I think this is almost just a speak up challenge. That are the top people hearing what the bottom people are saying?
Yeah, and do they want to hear it?
Yes.
I mean, the inventory thing is probably the biggest thing to get started with, I think.
Yep.
I just guarantee you it's being used way more than anybody even thinks, despite your policy. People have laptops, they have iPads, they have phones, they can get the same stuff on, despite it being locked down on, your corporate computer or whatever. Getting some kind of an inventory, whether actual or even hypothetical, I think will give you a starting point on starting to categorize and even just see kind of what's in the garage. That show where you they buy a storage wars or something. It's like you have to open up that gate to see what's in your unit. You have to open that gate and see how AI is actually being used. And I think, I think there are some smart ways. If your first step is truly to inventory how it might or how it is being used in your organization, I think you have to be smart about how you ask those questions, whether that's through a survey or whether it's talking to managers, because people always have that self-preservation. And so if you're asking, I'm just saying this question is not as effective as the second question I'm about to say. How are you using AI in your job? They're going to say, I'm not using it. Or you could say, how might somebody in your position utilize AI to do their job? You're probably going to get a better picture of how that might be used and probably hear more about how people are actually using it. But I just think there's a massive disconnect between how much an organization thinks it's being used and how much they think it's being locked down versus how much it's actually being used and how little it's actually locked down. It's just a massive, massive disconnect.
It's funny that the agency that, in my opinion, seems to be giving the best, most specific advice for AI right now is the state of New York. Department of Financial Services has proposed regulations for AI in the insurance industry. And they did say, like, the very first thing that insurers should be doing, and they haven't formalized all this into a rule, but I'm pretty sure when DFS suggests that you do something, you do it. Take an inventory of every single use of AI that your company currently has, that you thought about having, that you've used and didn't work and you decommissioned it, or that you're likely to use within the next year or so. But that was their very first bullet point. Take an inventory of the AI usage within your firm. Even though it is geared for insurance people, that guidance, that proposal is worth reading if you're in any industry at all, because it just hits to a lot of how are you using this? How are you controlling for it? And I think a lot of companies will probably find, oh crap, we didn't know that and we're not controlling it yet. The last cute point I wanted to talk about, it's not necessarily cute, but it's an interesting news item. From the world of sports, the National Basketball Association booting one of its players for life because he was betting on his own performance. His name was Jonte Porter from the Toronto Raptors, in for, I think, 4 seasons or so. Not a very good player, but he, within the last several months or so, started betting on his own performance through surrogates and friends. Would he be playing for 5 minutes? Would he be making these many 3-pointers or not? Not actually betting on the outcome of the games. But I am fascinated by this as a compliance exercise because the sports books and the NBA use data analytics to figure out there's no way people would be betting this much on this nobody of a player, Jonte Porter. This must be suspicious. They investigated, found it out, and then when they concluded that, yes, he's been betting improperly, talk about consequence management, like the Justice Department loves to talk about. A lifetime ban, I am sure, is going to get the attention of every other NBA player. So I don't know if either of you have either followed that news story specifically or just have any thoughts about the importance of data analytics, but I was stunned. They did all of this within 3 months, figured out what they want to do, sent the message, done within 90 days. It was amazing.
Yeah, it'll be fun to hear the actual story, the order of events of who got first tipped off by it. Did they communicate before they went to the NBA? I would love to hear that full story because, I mean, to your point, it's such a mosaic that's kind of came together pretty quickly, It's funny, somebody alleging, is this like the NBA's version of Pete Rose? Kind of, sort of. Except Pete Rose was one of the most famous players in the game. And I actually think this matters because if somebody like Jaylen Brown on the Boston Celtics is one of the best players on one of the best teams right now, if he were doing this, I think everybody would notice that's weird. Yeah.
But this was a backbench player. And occasionally fraud risks come from people who are just sitting way in the back, trying not to look conspicuous at all. And yet the sports books were the ones who said, how on earth is it that this nobody, people are making $100,000 bets on his performance when usually they might be making bets of $50. And that was the thread that led to this deciphering of it. But it's all about good data analytics. It's all about working with other data partners because the sports books figured this out first. And they don't need this headache either. So they immediately told the Raptors and the NBA, this seems like a problem. And then the NBA took it from there. And then, this importance of consequence management. And, look at the FDIC that we talked about half an hour ago, not taking any action against offenders. This is certainly an action that's going to make every single NBA player stand up and take notice that this is not to be trifled with in this organization. Karen, what do you think about these kind of lessons?
Yeah, the aspect of this story that I like the most, or that interests me the most, is the fact that it was the sports book companies that identified this and notified the NBA. So to me, the question here is, how are you creating pathways for your business partners or other stakeholders to surface issues within your own organization? We all talk about helplines and employee reporting. And a lot of us also put in these kind of third-party obligations, sometimes within our supply chain, and then we don't really work our way through, well, what kind of reporting lines are there? If you're a business partner and your main point of contact is the same business person that you're negotiating a deal with, can you complain to that person when there's a problem, and where else are you going to raise issues? So, I mean, in this case, there was a mutual interest in surfacing this, and so I think it was DraftKings who first contacted the NBA with their data analytics. But you really want to start examining, what are my stakeholder and supply chain opportunities for raising concerns, and how am I going to act on those? There's this whole huge host of issues. Certainly the sportsbook people were not going to be allowed into the Raptors locker room to do the investigation. You have to then count on the receiving organization to have a robust investigations program. So I love this whole story for that kind of reason, the relationship between an entity and its stakeholders to surface misconduct and follow up on that misconduct.
Philippe, what's up, Philippe? Philippe just brought up this point, or he asked this question: did they notify because it was the right thing, or because they were losing money? So I think it's a smart question, but I think there's a lesson in there for us. Like, the body, right there, we have this sort of authoritative body, the NBA, and then where this thing was kind of uncovered, that other group, they had some kind of an incentive and some kind of a drive to do it. While it might be their own pocketbook, they engaged that like motivation to make that happen. And what can we as organizations or leaders do to create more of those incentives? They don't have to be monetary, but some kind of an incentive that is going to help reinforce that motivation and that that commitment, ultimately that willingness to report. These guys were obviously very willing to, I'm sure they were calling each other up and saying like, hey, are a bunch of guys betting on this guy? And everyone's like, yeah, we're puzzled by that too. We need to do something about it because we're losing money. But that impetus, that like drive to get an answer for it, or to kind of bubble that up, I think there's got to be some lesson we can pull from that.
Well, I think, if my understanding of this is correct, is that, there is a larger ecosystem here that heavily drives these people to report this, because if you don't, and that's always another question to try and consider, can you create an ecosystem where not reporting it would be an extremely poor decision? If the sports books knew about this and took no action, and the NBA later found out, the NBA would land on those sports books with both feet, and you'd probably lose the privilege to be able to bet on games. This is a federal crime to participate or support throwing professional sports games. So if you covered it up or ignored it as a sports book, you probably get a call from your local U.S. attorney. Not going to be a fun experience. So there was just so much of that. They did actually work very hard to do all of this. And I mean, let's remember that the Justice Department also talks a lot about the importance of data analytics to root out misconduct. And this whole ecosystem of, every single sports event, point of data is tracked and analyzed, whether that's baseball, basketball, anything. Everybody now has digitally transformed their tracking of sports performance. So it was a thing that was naturally going to be suited to data analytics. So it's another point to keep in mind. What would good data analytics look like in your organization? Study how it worked at the NBA here, because it worked really well for them. And what lessons could you take away for all your transactions that have been digitally transformed?
I'd love if you could write a Michael Lewis style book on this whole thing, Matt.
That
would be great.
I should be so talented as Michael Lewis. I mean, I wait for like some sort of, I don't know, Netflix episode or something like that. But it is a great, great story about, there is corruption in professional sports, but it is getting easier to at least be able to identify it. And then the NBA took it took a hard action, but it was absolutely the right one to take, to exile him for life. All right. So
to that point, again, there's all these hints in our data. that
Yes.
if we're looking at it and we're carving out a little time just to look for some kind of anomalies, you're going to find something to kind of investigate. And I'm not trying to add anything to anyone's to-do list, which is already too long, but like there are significant things that we can find that can have a massive impact if we just kind of get out of our, lift our head up real quick and see what's going on. That's what those triggers must have been, right? Like this is too much money for this kind of a playtime, or too much money for,
Yes.
relative to the dollars that have been, bet on this individual for so long. There was an anomaly that popped out that generated that response,
And there's a good use of AI.
There you go.
All right. Well, so we are out of time this hour right now, but Karen Moore, thank you very much. And everybody who's listening and everybody who chimed in with the chat, that's all been great. And Nick, I don't know if you have any other final comments or whatnot, but this has been a great hour.
Yeah, great hour as usual. Thank you guys both. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Karen. It's always a great discussion when you guys join. Couple quick announcements. Next week, we're going to be doing a really cool episode. This was a talk we did at a conference recently that got really high reviews, and it's how you can become a better software buyer. Many of us have to buy software from time to time, and it's a very frustrating process. At least it is for me when I'm buying software. So we have a great framework that we're going to be helping you with to minimize the risk of buying the wrong thing and maximizing the potential of having a really smooth implementation and a quick speed to value. So there's some good tactics in that. And then keep a lookout. Again, please hit that survey if you love me, okay? And then keep a lookout for this documentary that's coming. The Women in Compliance documentary is going to be launched in the next couple of days here. Look for us on social for a preview of it. And it's really cool. You guys are really going to enjoy this documentary. We've interviewed tons and tons of people, and there's some great insights captured there. So one more round of applause for Matt. One more round of applause for Karen. And we'll see you guys next week. Take care.
Thank you.